Hey everybody, welcome back. Now we're in Unit 3, where we're taking a region-specific look at the United Nations. So the first half of this unit, through 5 lectures instead of 7, we'll be looking at regions writ large. In other words, we're looking at how regions act as an organizing principle for countries to work at the UN, and also how the UN uses regions as a way to channel its work and its efforts, and maybe perhaps through partnerships to expand what they're able to do. The idea that the UN is all-encompassing is one that may pervade with you since we started talking in this class, but I want to introduce you to a whole host of organizations also doing work, sometimes completely separately from the UN, sometimes in partnership with them, so together they can do more expansive things. This will also be a chance in this unit for you to choose the region that you're most interested in looking at this unit. So I'll give you a lot of ways to think of a region, and then here by the end of the fifth lecture, I'll have you pick. And that doesn't seem too difficult, except it's a more complicated question than you may imagine, and we'll make more sense of that as we go through these first 5 lectures. So I'd like to start with another intergovernmental organization, another IGO, that you may be familiar with, and I want to use them because you may be familiar with them before I introduce you to a whole host of other regional organizations. So the European Union is well known as the organizing entity that brings together several dozen states in Western, Central, and Eastern Europe. Used to all be West Europe, but it's expanded over the last decade or so. They have a presence at the UN. They have an observer mission at the UN, and they work hard to impact decision making at the United Nations. So this is a clip from the EU at the UN Twitter feed. The 72nd United Nations General Assembly opened in September of 2017, and they are present. So what they try and do is serve as an organizing entity for European states, the member states of the European Union, when they're trying to make decisions on what position to take at the General Assembly. It doesn't mean that they'll always harmonize positions, but they'll give it a shot. So the European Union, well, we looked at the end of Unit 2 at missions to the UN. The EU also has a mission to the UN. There's a place called EU House, quite near in proximity to the United Nations headquarters itself. And there will be upwards of 1,000 meetings in a given year where EU House will host the ambassadors or other diplomats from their member states at EU House, maybe in the middle of a day, maybe on a break from a formal meeting, but they'll come in and try and harmonize positions. So the EU is not like the UN, similarly like the UN, is not an overarching organization that always shapes what individual member states in the EU will want to do. So they can't just say, this is our position, you all must follow it, because all those individual states are taking direction from their home governments. But there are a number of places where the EU has a harmonized position, and they try and perpetuate that through their presence at the UN. So you can look at what say France is doing at the UN, Germany is doing at the UN. Also, though, what those states are doing through the EU at the UN. So all of these organizations, these big regional IGOs, some of them aren't as large as the EU, but lots of them have sizable number of member states. They're trying to coordinate position at the United Nations. And one of the reasons is that when you're talking about the different number of votes, say in a GA setting where different countries will have different numbers of votes. I'm sorry, countries will have the same number of votes, but regions will have different numbers of votes. It presumes that the regions have the same perspectives, which they don't. Like just because you're from South America doesn't mean you all think alike. But if you're part of an IGO, that harmonization can be coordinated or be furthered along through conversation in those member states. Now, just because there are IGOs that exist doesn't mean they exist for organizing on most things at the UN. For example, meet BIMSTEC. BIMSTEC is one of the more awkwardly named IGOs out there. It stands for the Bay of Bengal Initiative for Multi-Sectoral Technical and Economic Cooperation, which you don't have to remember. I'm just giving you the meaning of the acronym. And it has these 7 states are members of BIMSTEC. So they exist there in the Bay of Bengal, and they have very particular things they're working on, which means that it doesn't, because they only work on those issues, that their perspectives, their ideas, their collective efforts don't come into play very often at the United Nations at all. So you won't necessarily see a BIMSTEC at the UN like you would see EU at the UN. There is no BIMSTEC membership there, though they can come together on certain things related to multi-sectoral technical and economic cooperation. They may have perspectives on those, but other than that, they won't. So you can't automatically look at an IGO or regional IGO and say, oh, they're going to be active at the UN or they're active in the GA, because they very well may not be. But there are many others that are broader. So this is a mix here. We'll start with the bottom two, NATO and the Pacific Alliance. They're very specific kinds of organizations, like BIMSTEC is. That doesn't mean that they work on the same exact topics, but they have a more narrow focus. NATO, for example, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, is a common defense and military alliance. So it has the United States, it has and Canada has most of Western Europe. And so if there's a topic that's of interest to NATO, they'll come together. But if it's an economic topic, then NATO won't be present, which is different than the Pacific Alliance, which is a handful of Latin American states who are emergent markets and who have a lot to offer in terms of economic cooperation. They won't be allied in any way on a defense or strategic military conversations, because that's not what their alliance is about. So for things to really exist at the UN, they have to be broader in mandate than just defense or just economy. So here's some other ones then. ASEAN is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. They work on a lot of things like the European Union does, so they are fairly active. CARICOM also does a lot, but they're the Caribbean community, and as many times as you loop them together in different configurations, there's still a group of small Caribbean states, so they're a bit limited in what they can do. One of the ones that shows that you can't necessarily judge by the name whether they'll be broad-based or more narrow is the Economic Community of West African States, which was founded as an economic community, but has begun to do so much more. For example, they're one of the partners we'll talk about in a minute in terms of peacekeeping initiatives, where ECOWAS does have collaborative peacekeeping forces and military troops that work in partnership with the Security Council. So you can't just go by the title either. You have to read what they're up to and what their current mandate is to know whether they're one of those that's very broad, like the EU at the UN, doing lots of different things, or more narrow, like BIMSTEC, which only comes together on certain things. So NATO on certain things, Pacific Alliance on certain things, these others more broadly. Now, one of the ways these groups can become of interest to the UN as a partner is that individually they might not have much in the way of an ability to impact conversations about a particular topic. For example, if you really want to work on, say, a peaceful resolution to a civil war in West Africa. Recently, there was an issue in Gambia with whether the president there would step down. Any individual state in the rest of West Africa could not be a partner for the UN to work through to convince the leader to leave Gambia. But collectively, ECOWAS could be. So then they become a partner to the UN because of their ability to leverage collective action. The same sort of thing in Southeast Asia, where none of the individual states are powerful enough on their own to become a partner with the UN, but collectively they can be. Doesn't always work because there's only so many Caribbean states you can band together to try and influence things outside the Caribbean, but it does work if you're trying to have another small island state change the way they're doing things. CARICOM can come together as a useful partner. But speaking of partnerships, there are a lot of these, and I'm going to only go over two kinds here today. So on the left is this picture of the Sustainable Development Goals. They're things you should be familiar with. Certainly something you should remember coming out of this class, that the UN is heavily invested in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. They recognize they can't do it alone, and they recognize also that individual member states, even partnering with nonprofits and with NGOs and with the private sector in terms of multinational corporations and others, probably can't do this alone either. So they need these topics discussed at many different levels at many different times so that the ideas are put out there as firmly and as far as possible. So the African Union, for example, has something called the New Partnership for Africa's Development, or NEPAD. So this is their approach that goes far past 2030. I think their goal on NEPAD goes all the way through 2050 to get all their programs done. But they're going to work in partnership with the UN then to achieve their development goals with and through the UN. And the reason it works in partnership nicely, I should point out that the partnership here in NEPID does not refer to the partnership with the UN, but an internal partnership in Africa itself. But the reason they'll work together is because the UN has the goals and they have a limited ability to carry them out. NEPID needs partners beyond Africa to invest in them, and it makes a lot of sense for them to work together. So around the world, there'll be partnerships between the UN and the member states, yes, but also the regional organizations they belong to try and achieve them. One of the ways we do this is through regional development banks, which we'll talk about further in topic 3.5. So another place where there's partnerships is with the Security Council on peacekeeping. So one of the first ones one of the ones that may be familiar with you through more recent history is NATO in Afghanistan, which is one where, if you go back to the founding principles of NATO, it's the North Atlantic Treaty Organization because it impacts peace and security in the North Atlantic. And that might not seem then to be something that would be present in Afghanistan. But beginning in the late 1990s, when the UN needed a partner, or wanted a partner anyway, to help with peacekeeping in the Yugoslavia area. Yugoslavia has since broken up into many subparts, and one of the things that helped end the Civil War was a partnership with NATO, is that the UN Security Council, instead of calling in a unique mission that is built, owned, and designed by the United Nations Security Council with troop contributors from these member states, they partner with an organization instead. So this is a slide. It's from 2009, but it gives you a sense of the large number of troops that were present in a UN-backed, but not a UN mission, a UN-backed NATO mission in Afghanistan. So you've got the 18,000 U.S. troops. You certainly wouldn't see that in a UN mission. The U.S. would not be loaning troops in that number there. And then all these other NATO member states, plus partners like Australia, which is not part of NATO there. So they've done this with NATO, with the European Union, or the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe in both Bosnia and the Congo, with the African Union in Somalia and Darfur. Darfur now is a UN peacekeeping mission. It's called UNAMID. So if you looked at UNAMID, you'd see it's called a hybrid mission with the African Union in Darfur. But in Somalia, the Security Council basically greenlit the AU to go in and do peacekeeping in Somalia. And also ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States in Sierra Leone, as another important partner, so that ECOWAS could take the lead there. And it was an ECOWAS army, basically, organized the same way that the Security Council organizes peacekeeping missions, but directly through ECOWAS. So these will be backed by the UN and their partnerships. So you're going to work in and through. Indonesia has proposed the formation of a ASEAN peacekeeping force should the need arise in that region. There's no current missions there. There have been missions there in Southeast Asia, in the past. So it's received positively. They're also probably going to be more nimble and more able to respond. For example, NATO has troops pledged to it. The treaty that NATO operates under has basically ready troops. Like there's troops promised to NATO. So if NATO has a mission, you can move quickly. Whereas if it's a UN mission, there's no one who has troops pledged to the UN. They can't respond quickly. So in that process we talked about in Unit 2, we have to go through and build a whole mission. These regional partners have troops ready to go. And so if you say, we deputize or we're going to work with this regional group, they can probably get someplace much faster than the UN could in a traditional peacekeeping mission. So what does this mean? It means that regions matter at the United Nations. We're going to look next time about spots at the UN, which may sound creepy. It may sound like there's a disease, measles, or chickenpox or something. We're talking about spots in organizing the different committee meetings of the United Nations and how that all fits together. In this case, we're looking at how the regions form a means for which smaller states can formally lobby with each other to have a bigger whole and negotiate better at the United Nations, but also how those regions can get their initiatives through, their ideas through, and how the UN can partner with regions to get things done. Regions matter at the United Nations, and even though the member states are the primary organizing entity, together with the Secretariat, regions sort of bring those two together in real and interesting ways.